It's so good to see all of you. So many old friends, some new faces. For those who are new to the center, I'm Jim Ferris. I'm a professor in the Saul Price School of Public Policy at USC and also director of the Center on Philanthropy and Public Policy. For the last 23 years, I've had the privilege and pleasure of directing this center and working with many of you to shine a spotlight on philanthropy and its impact on our communities. We're started to kick off the academic year with a conversation we've been wanting to have about the state of philanthropy at this moment as we transition to whatever comes next. For the last 3 years, I've been constantly asked, what does this all mean for philanthropy? And I've demurred. It's not because I don't have a response, but I learned 23 years ago not to assume that everything's going to be like you think it is. When we started the center in 2000, everyone was talking about how there was going to be a revolution in philanthropy, the new philanthropy. And that's sort of come and gone, and while there have been changes, significant ones, it wasn't a revolution. So I'm a little bit guarded at making great pronouncements. Those folks up in the Silicon Valley, they're always shaking things up. They've been doing it for 3 decades now. And we know that there are changes afoot, but it's hard in the moment to really fully appreciate or understand them. I was reading The Economist back in March, and they were heralding the arrival of philanthropy 3.0 or 4.0. They're always looking for what's new, the shiny new object. And so now it's not just Silicon Valley, it's McKinsey Scott too. So anyway, I couldn't think of anyone more fitting to start this conversation about where has philanthropy been, where it's come through these 3 years, and where we're headed than Grant Oliphant. I've long admired Grant from his days in Pittsburgh, first with Heinz, the Heinz Endowments, then the Pittsburgh Foundation, back to Heinz. And along the way, he's also not only been a regional leader, but he's played a major role on the national landscape of philanthropy. He chaired the Communications Network and then the Center for Effective Philanthropy. So he has this regional, national perspective, and now he has the San Diego perspective. So we're glad that he's out west. I think he's going to be starting another podcast, but during the pandemic, I often listen to We Can Be, the podcast he did at the Heinz Endowment, and I think it's as good today as it was when you did them. So I encourage you to look for those. We've also benefited from his insights. He's participated in a couple of major forums that the center has hosted. The first one was our work with Elwood Hopkins and Rip Rapson on drawing on Detroit in 2016, and then subsequently work we did with Fred Ali and the Weingart Foundation on achieving equity, which was in 2017, so it predates 2020. So there are folks that have great foresight about what's around the corner, which is what we need now. So we're delighted that he's with us now that he's down in San Diego, and I'll let him talk about the foundation he's standing up in a way with all of the wisdom from his years in Pittsburgh. I'm not going to ask him the questions today, at least not formally, because we have Cindy Kennard to do that. Cindy she always has questions. And when my phone rings during the football games, she has lots of questions. Some sports related, some not. Okay, But, she was a broadcast journalist. She's been in Texas, Russia, the former Yugoslavia, NPR, and then headed up major nonprofit organizations. And now those that are local know that she's currently the managing executive director of the Annenberg Foundation. I also have the pleasure of having her as my board chair, so I get lots of questions. But what's even better when she says, I have a great idea, let's do this. And we do it. I want to just highlight a couple of the things she's done in recent years. She's worked with some of her colleagues in LA on the Food Security Network in LA County. That's the outgrowth of efforts during the pandemic for food security. And just this spring, she corralled 22 women foundation CEOs to meet at Sunnylands and talk about women in leadership roles in philanthropy and what they can do. And my colleague Alex sort of joined me for that event. And so she's always creating new things for us. And so we appreciate that. And with that, I'm going to bring up Grant and Cindy and let them get going.
Right.
So Jim, first of all, thanks very, very much. And I actually am honored to be the chair of the board. And I think I'm looking out at my beloved colleagues in this room. And thank you, Dr. Ross, for joining us today. We're glad to see you. And thinking really, Jim, what the center has done for all of us. And as I look at Jennifer, a new leader, head of the Parsons Foundation here in Los Angeles, and Garen and I with our living donors and all the things that we go through, Jim actually has pulled all of us together, and Richard in his new role has pulled us all together in a group where we actually can seek counsel from one another, where we can seek support from one another. So above all, this center is unique and special and has certainly helped me along my journey to where I am today, which I cannot even believe is almost 9 years at the head of the Annenberg Foundation. So off we go with our guest today. Jim mentioned your new assignment in philanthropy. Let's just start there. You're in San Diego. You're actually standing up a foundation. We of this world know that is not easy. But tell us a little bit about the foundation.
Sure. So the foundation is the Conrad Prebys Foundation, and it has no family affiliated with it. And I came from a long tenure, as you heard from Jim, in family philanthropy, which I loved. But I was drawn to this in part by the opportunity to stand up an entirely new foundation and to have it be one that operates independently with a community board. And we can talk about all the differences if you'd like
of which there are many.
During the course of this conversation. I would also like to say, Cindy, I know many of the people in this room as well, or at least several of you, and I have reflected a lot coming from Pittsburgh, which for those of you who don't know it, is one of the most fully formed, mature philanthropic communities in the United States. People collaborate as if it's in the DNA. There's a large set of multi-billion-dollar foundations that work together seamlessly. And to be back in a room where there is a community nexus of philanthropic thinking and talent is it's really touching and valuable for me, because that has been one of the learnings for me. And it's also one of the draws of going to San Diego was San Diego is in a different part of its journey, where our foundation is one of the early large ones, and over the course of the next generation, rather than fixing it by years, we're going to see a lot of private foundations formed there, but they're not there yet. And one of the things you miss, and that sometimes you take for granted in rooms like this, is how valuable it is to have rooms like this.
We have so much to talk about, but I think there are several family foundation leaders in this room. So just a little bit about the difference. And you're still in the first part of this journey on this job in San Diego, but just what struck you about the difference between being a family foundation leader
Yeah.
and a...
Well, so what I'm doing now is reminds me almost more of being a community foundation head than of being head of a private foundation that was family affiliated, simply in that the board that I answer to is, there isn't a center of gravity on that board. The center of gravity is the community itself and the interests that are represented on the board. In a family foundation, usually the center of gravity, I mean, by definition, is the family, and it's the principle of the family if there is one. If you're lucky, as you and I have been in our experience, you have that center of gravity is morally grounded, visionary, thoughtful about the work, and really captivated by the idea of philanthropy. That's not always the case in family philanthropy, and so we need to count ourselves as lucky for those of us who have been able to do that. But what I'm experiencing now is the beauty and the challenge of figuring out what a community's largest independent foundation should be so that we can set a template for what philanthropy can be in the future in San Diego. So that's tremendous fun, and it's something that I didn't get to do in Pittsburgh, but it is also very challenging.
Well, I think everybody would agree, we're living in some really uniquely challenging times. So with that in mind, in the early days of the pandemic, you noted that we, philanthropy and society, faced 3 existential questions. How do we survive this tragedy and other crises such as racial unrest, economic disruption? How do we restore normalcy? And how do we reimagine what's next? At this point in time, can you even answer any of these questions?
Well, I think what we would all, so the grant that is sitting here in 2023 would counsel humility to the grant who wrote that.
Courage.
I do think as those things have played out, they are still as relevant, weirdly, today as they felt in 2019. And we've learned some humbling lessons about how difficult and connected each of those stages are. So the language I used at the time was, I think, return, rebuild, and then reimagine. And the return piece felt like, well, obviously we're going to get through COVID and we'll all go back to work. Whoops. And we haven't even actually done that, and we're living through repercussions. Just a few of us were talking beforehand about what's happening in our downtown. So something as simple as the return concept is playing out in radically different ways than we would have expected then. But then you look at the other 2 components. The rebuild component was all, I made an assumption there too, that we would, whatever we were about to go through, we would figure out how to snap back. And what I was trying to drive at was, snap back is actually not the goal. Snap back, we really need to be thinking about rebuilding in the context of reimagining, because there are so many things about our present society that don't work, that of course we have to think about how to reinvent it at the same time as the rebuilding. The humility piece for me there is that I underestimated the extent to which simple rebuilding for the nonprofit sector in many areas would be so difficult and still be playing out in so many profound ways 3 years later. And I think we have all learned a lesson that certain things that we took for granted about the nonprofit sector prior to COVID, we can no longer take for granted. And that has to do with donor patterns, it has to do with assumptions about effectiveness, it has to do with assumptions we make about development and the development of talent, capacity building of organizations. Actually, I think some very important work is being done here in LA around that, exciting work that I hope San Diego can learn from. But the rebuilding piece, where we still haven't fully understood the ways in which that will play out. Our foundation, one of the issues that we care about is the arts, and we are, I believe, still unsure of what the impact of the COVID era will be ultimately on the survivability of our arts institutions. So just something simple like that, something like that illustrates for us how hard rebuilding is. The reimagine piece, I actually think we've done some of our best work in thinking about that. I'm looking at Bob, and Bob, sorry to call you out, but you have elevated the game in terms of helping us understand. And thank you for the reflections piece you've been doing, and the work that we have understood a need to change our practices in philanthropy.
But there's also somewhat of frustration around, did that happen then and we're moving on in philanthropy? And so whatever the systemic issues that were really amplified, and we all said, my God, I hadn't realized it was that bad.
Yes.
And now, are we moving past those and saying, well, that was then, and there's a lot of frustration in the communities, I think, about that, certainly within California. And then there's a lot of confusion among philanthropic leaders to make sure that doesn't happen. So how do you reconcile not just moving on because that was then and this is now with the issues? For example, the economic issue.
Yeah. Jim was mentioning earlier the revolutions in philanthropy. I've lived through at least 3 eras of philanthropy completely reinventing itself, and every single wave has had the same characteristics. It's been led by really smart people who believe that they are the solution to the problem we've had. They have made sweeping generalizations about what was wrong with philanthropy in the past and what would be better about it in the future that they imagine. And then the third element is that they posit that they have the elements that the rest of us need in order for that imagined better future to come about, that they're going to lead. And I am now, I don't want to say jaded, but I no longer listen to the idea that this is the moment at which philanthropy changes, because I have just seen that we don't do that. But human beings don't do that. And in a country that suffers almost from ADD as a cultural phenomenon throughout our history. We get interested in things and we get bored in things, and we move on. That is true. But it doesn't mean that the field of which we're a part doesn't slowly begin to internalize new and different practices. I think we are absolutely guilty already of having moved on, as is the broader culture. I was talking with a friend of mine who runs a DEI practice the other day, who was sharing with me that fully 70+% of the positions created post-George Floyd to work in DEI with companies have been eliminated since. So, you do get a sense that, yes, this is the number he used, and I've checked it, and it does check out. Wow. But the extraordinary lack of persistence that we have around issues, I think so we have to acknowledge that, and we have to accept the criticism and say this is, yes, we have to do better. At the same time, we have to have the integrity to look at ourselves and ask whether we're beginning to internalize different practices. And I do hear a different conversation among philanthropy today than I did 5 years ago. It starts at a different place.
How is that?
Well, it starts at a different place around the central supposition of who should be in the room. It starts at a different place in terms of the central supposition about who has voice or the right to have voice. You know, I think the notion about needing to get more proximate to community is thematic across the board for most of us. Now, we may not do it really well, but I think the encouragement we have to give each other is there is a different starting point. And here's why. Because I know of, this is probably true of many fields, but I know of no field that I've worked with that has the deep degree of self-hatred that philanthropy sometimes displays toward itself, where we feel almost like it's our assignment to figure out the pathologies that afflict us and declare them publicly and make sure that everybody understands them first. And it is true that we suffer from them. You know, you could name almost any one of them, and it is true that we suffer from them. But what we also have to embrace is that a critical part of our mission, probably the way in which we failed the most during the pandemic, in my opinion, is not finding the problem, it's inspiring people with the cure. And if we're not doing it about our own work, then we're not doing it for the people that we're trying to help.
So in a way, that's what we need in place for the next crisis. That sort of a mindset, is it? What do we need?
Well, I think, okay, so the next crisis, there are a bunch looming on the horizon, you know, and we haven't gotten through the other ones, by the way. So, you know, in our work, we're doing we're paying a lot of attention to the youth mental and behavioral health crisis. This is not new, but it is accelerating. We're paying a lot of attention to issues around climate change. Not new, but accelerating. We're seeing the two of them connected and feed off of each other in terms of how people feel elevating senses of despair and uncertainty about what the best solutions are. So you can go on and on down the list. You know, we've got an election looming. That's complicated. And who knows what other crises are coming. But if the people doing this work cannot, in our work, do two things, then I think we will fail. So one of those is, yes, articulate a vision for the true north that we are heading towards. And by the way, as much as I think philanthropic practice is important, it isn't about your grant application. It is about the messages that you are communicating to people in every aspect of your operations, your storytelling, the narrative of who you are in the world, and the way in which you listen to community. So that's one piece, just telling a better, more inspiring story of what we believe about the future. And the second is really getting more proximate to community and elevating different voices and engaging a set of grantees that we haven't been as committed to in the past as we should be in the future.
And does that mean?
It means advocacy. It means neighborhood and community groups. It means people doing the work. It means not speaking for community. It means taking the time to let community speak for itself. You know, when I came into this work, for 20 years, I heard myself say, and people in the work say, that we have to be the voice for the voiceless. And a guy on my staff one day said to me, you know, that is so wrong. We have voices. It's that you aren't listening. So his point was we have to have better ears. And I think that, you know, I do think that there are more foundations willing to talk about that today. I do think there are more foundations willing to acknowledge that today. And I think we're on an imperfect journey in terms of doing it.
Grant, I'm going to ask the audience to start thinking about some questions because this should be an interactive discussion. So in just a few minutes, we'll turn to you all. But let's talk for a minute about philanthropy as an improvisation. So from the Heinz Foundation blog, March 3rd in 2020, in the craft of improv.
Boy, talk about being hoist on your own petard by your own writings. Don't ever write anything.
This is fun. I feel like I'm back in my old career. There is a fundamental rule known as yes. And when someone hands off an idea or situation to you, you don't dismiss or argue. You take it as a starting point and build on it. What does this attribute mean for leadership?
Yeah.
A little bit of what you've been talking about.
So when I wrote that, I wrote it in a very specific context, but I believe it fully anyway, so I'm going to own it, and I'll answer your question. But the context, just to remind everybody, was we were about to go into the early days of the pandemic. People were panicking. We didn't know how long it would last, and there were a lot of folks who were just trying not to be dragged into this new reality. I think all of us were dealing with that. And what I was challenging folks in our community to do was accept where we were and the uncertainty of where we were headed, and to figure out our actions based on that new reality as opposed to wishing for one that no longer existed. I actually have found that to be invaluable for me in my leadership of a foundation doing this work, and I have found it to be invaluable over the course of the past 7 or 8 years, actually. Because I have found that our sector keeps, those of us who are doing the sort of work that you all in this room are doing, are inevitably going to keep finding ourselves facing new crises and new challenges and things that are not the world that we want to bring about. And we're going to find ourselves, by the way, in our own actions falling short in responding to that. And I think one of the flaws in our culture that is mirrored by a flaw in our field is that the increasingly instinctive reaction is no but. It is, I will not accept this, I do not accept you, you are wrong, this situation is wrong, and that is 100% understandable, but we actually never get anywhere on the basis of that. And I think that as a mantra for leaders, it is just accept the newly changed circumstances that you walk into every day and figure out what the next move is.
It's a great challenge in the workplace today, though. I mean, I have to acknowledge that I think I've never found it more challenging to be a leader, particularly as relates to the workplace itself. And so that's so hard. Talk to us a little bit about that's so hard in the culture of where we are today, among just the workforce that we have to manage every day.
You know, yes. Yes, I mean, it is. And that's part of the yes and is to, you know, we are in a generational shift in terms of how people view the correct response to challenges. And part of that has manifested particularly over the course of the past 6 or 7 years in terms of how younger people in the workplace perceive what is rightful action in the context of the very real challenges that we face. The most adroit leaders that I have seen of all kinds have acknowledged this, respected this, talked about this, and worked like mad to make sure that their organizations aren't undone by it. You know, I do think the self-reflection in our sector about how much time our sector has spent tearing itself apart internally within organizations, within social purpose organizations, within foundations, being hypercritical of our own practices there's been a necessary amount of, or level of self-reflection in that, and a potentially damaging and excessive amount of not focusing on the work itself. And what I've seen leaders do is just talk about that balance in their organizations. And I don't think the point of this is to say it's easy, because it's not easy. And for those of us who are trying to ride this wave, I think it remains very challenging, but I don't think it's easy for anybody.
No, it sort of reminds me, I keep saying this to my staff, when I was Jim acknowledged my last career, and I remember sort of being as a war correspondent and among refugees and people that had been through a war, and then they came out of it. And the trauma just seemed to go on and on and on. And sometimes I'm in the workplace and I'm just with that trauma from those years of that pandemic and George Floyd and every other horrible thing that happened is still sitting in these workplaces for leaders to manage. You can feel it, you can see it, and so I think the mental health, while we're addressing the community at the same time, we're having it internally as well. I think that's a little different.
There's no question that, look, if you're a serious person doing this work and you care about the issues, it is taxing, exhausting, emotionally draining work. And it is for young people coming into the work who are still learning the ways of the work and looking at all the reporting that's being done about the future that they're looking at. And it is for leaders of a certain generation who are trying to share the things that we've seen and the wisdom that hopefully we have and the perspective that we have, and everybody in between. And if you're trying to, so for all of us, there's a lot of the work that is exhausting, and then there are people in our midst who are even closer to those sources of trauma and feel it more acutely and more personally in their bones because of how close they are to whatever is happening. One of the reasons I do the podcast that Jim mentioned is because it is great therapy for me. Yeah. It isn't about you all. It's great therapy for me because it lets me talk to people in kind of an unguarded context who are not me, who are looking at the world differently, and who can reflect with me on what they're experiencing and feeling, which I don't get to do in quite the same way with my team, and certainly not with folks in the community in quite the same way. The new podcast that we've started at the Prebys Foundation is called Stop and Talk, which I used to think We Can Be was a dreadful podcast name. Now I think Stop and Talk is worse. But the reason we adopted this title after much angst over it was the thing we were seeing missing in the culture that we were all experiencing, my entire team, young and old, across the gambit, was a failure to allow each other space to stop and actually connect and have a moment just to reflect. And when you think about it, that really is so often what's missing.
Would you share with our colleagues how you find time to do a podcast, please?
Just like this. Just like
how do you
I love,
into your
in case
head?
you can't tell, I love talking to people. and I do think, I'm always a little embarrassed talking about the podcast then you start noticing articles like the one I came across in the New York Times recently about how every guy all of a sudden has a podcast. And apparently this is like a trope in dating now
just for guys?
Yeah, apparently, yeah. And there are, if you look at the number of podcasts, everybody on the planet has a podcast. But I think one of the privileges that we have in the roles that we have is that we get to talk to fascinating people. And if I'm going to do that anyway, my attitude is,
share it.
Why don't I share it?
Share it.
I'm going to have an interesting conversation. Maybe somebody will find it a benefit.
Great. Over the years, you've focused on creativity and learning, not just from others, but from us. We found a quote from you. Being a courageous, another quote. You ready?
Yes.
You ready?
I am.
Okay.
I'm ready.
Being a courageous and ethical leader in philanthropy means learning to listen. You've commented on that. And sharing our power by encouraging, empowering, and enabling others. Can you elaborate on how that quote shapes your leadership?
Yeah. So I think this is one of the most fundamental things for how I try to lead a foundation, especially now. I've always believed it, but I have a more acute and I hope more sophisticated sense of it now, that there needs to be a very deliberate process of letting go, letting others in, and actually listening is not just about my asking you a question and you answering my question. It's my actually tapping into the conversation that you want to have and trying to take away from that the things that I need to know so I can serve your work better. And I've had mentors in this room who have helped me get better at that, and I have had colleagues around the field who have helped me get better at that. But it is, I find, useful to me every single day in coming into a new community. You know, when you come into a new foundation role, and this is the third foundation that I've been privileged to lead, you make certain assumptions based on your prior experience. And I knew I was going to an alien culture, going from Pittsburgh to Southern California. But I thought, well, I know the private foundation world. The foundation I headed in Pittsburgh was twice the size of the Prebys Foundation. I got this. And every single day I had to learn a new lesson in what was different about the community. And just one small example of how this comes up. Part of the work that we do is in medical research. And medical research is not an area that I've worked in before in terms of leading a foundation that works in this space. What I knew immediately is medical research is a really hard space to fund effectively in, because the largest funders in that space are the federal government, to the tunes of hundreds of millions and billions of dollars. So we realized pretty early on that our space was going to be much more around equity, but how? You know, how was that going to come into play in our community? And this story is sort of told on the first podcast we have out with a doctor named Dr. Svasti Haricharan, who is a medical research scientist, cancer specialist at the Sanford Burnham Prebys Institute, named for our founder in part. But we ended up with Svasti in conversation with her because I went around to all of the very smart heads of the major research institutions in San Diego. And that is one of the amazing standout assets of San Diego. In terms of life sciences, that community is literally inventing the future. And the institutions there that are leading that work are beyond dynamic. So you look at our foundation and suddenly it begins to feel very small. And I asked, and my team asked everybody, what are the things that you're struggling with that you can't get money for? And once you get past the capital request for the conference room that nobody really needs, right? Yeah, and the new building, which is, the thing you always get first, especially in a town that's sort of used to individual donor development. What came up was as a theme, and we began to hear it quietly at first, but we began to tease it out, was, we can't keep women scientists. Well, okay, that's a problem with the sciences in general. We can't keep women researchers of color, particularly mid-career. Okay, so let's tease that out a bit. And what led me to Svasti was she, on her own time, as a researcher in the sciences, had done the work of documenting what that costs science and what it means in terms of lost economic performance in the community, lost innovation, lost opportunities for medical research innovations. And we were able to connect an equity play, if you will, in the community with an outcome that the community, that all those institutions told us were important. So we're launching a fellowship for women scientists, largely concentrating on women scientists in San Diego to try and plug this problem.
Because basically they were leaving once they did that.
They were leaving, yeah. But we wouldn't have heard that if we'd just gone in with our question protocol and actually listened also to people who were not the heads of institutions, but the ones doing the work.
On the front lines.
Right, exactly.
On the front lines.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Okay, so I just gave a talk last week to 500 people and had the embarrassing moment at the end where we asked for questions and nobody asked a question.
So
you are not going to do that. so somebody has to come
leave.
up.
Wendy, I think you have a question.
My question is about lived experience and community expertise. And how do you navigate sort of the self-appointeds in a community who may not really represent the community, but they've developed a role.
They know how to work the system.
So how do you find the authentic convenings that are the most meaningful?
Yeah, I wish I knew a perfect answer to this question, and it is, you find it in every community. You know, I had it in Pittsburgh, I have it in San Diego. You're asking, so you must have it in LA. And one thing I know for sure is that you cannot dismiss the self-anointeds just because you think they're the self-anointeds. You know, in a way, I have the same answer to this question that I do to, you know, usually I get a very different question from people who are individual donors and look at the nonprofit sector and say, why would you have so many organizations? Why don't we get rid of all the extraneous ones and just fund one in each area? And, you know, the answer is because we operate in a market, or the nonprofit world operates in a market just like the for-profit world does. And as long as there are donors and board members and supporters who are going to keep those organizations relevant and alive, they're going to be relevant and alive. The same answer kind of applies to people who are self-anointed in community. And I often have found that, yes, it is challenging to deal with them, and one way is to work around them and figure out who else in the community matters. But you will always have to deal with those folks anyway. And I think continuing to engage in conversation is the answer, even when you find it less than productive.
But I also think you made a great point before, which is you don't go to the top for those kinds of answers. You go to people on the front lines for those kinds of answers. Richard.
And we have a microphone. Hi, Grant. Richard Tate, President and CEO of the California Wellness Foundation. Welcome to Southern California.
Thank you.
It's a rare, exciting opportunity to be able to build an organization from the ground up. And I'm curious about what you're doing differently given that rare opportunity.
I am doing a whole lot of listening. You know, when I came into the role, one of the commitments I made to the community was that I was going to meet everybody I possibly could. And what I hear from people is I know more people than they do in San Diego now, which is wonderful. It's wonderful affirmation. But we, as a, you know, I had a tiny little staff when I started, and we've slowly been building it. But
How big is the staff?
We're at 12 now, and we'll probably go to 25, I think. And beyond that, I don't have visibility. But we are being very intentional about listening to the community at every level, and not just the sort of traditional playbook of going to civic leaders. And we've been, so that has been the most important thing. We have applied in real time as we've been learning and listening ideas that we're picking up or ideas that we may have, and then truth testing them with the community and feeding them back. And at this point, we have a plan that I think is a product of our own analysis, our own deep research, and listening to the community about what they want, and then feeding that back and getting some feedback back from them.
Can you stop and just give us an example of how that process works?
Yeah.
You know, feeding it back.
You know, I was actually thinking about this on the drive up because sometimes it looks remarkably similar. And so before I started, the foundation had it found itself suddenly funded. The board needed to move a bunch of money out into the community very quickly. And within a year, they gave away $90 million to 300 grantees. And this is in a community without a tradition of institutional philanthropy. So you can imagine how that felt to the community. It felt really good. It felt like somebody had arrived with a bag full of money, which is exactly what had happened. And so, a year later, after doing extensive work, one of the things we did was launch an initiative for healthcare clinics that in some ways mirrored aspects of that. We did an application that it took 20 minutes to fill out because we wanted it to be really easy to access the foundation. And we targeted healthcare clinics because they were on the front lines of working with those most in need of care and experiencing the greatest barriers. And we focused on border regions and indigenous communities for the same reason. And from the perspective of the grantees who applied under that program, that was kind of like manna from heaven. It wasn't a grant they were expecting 3 months prior to that. It was easy for them to access. It was a 2-year grant for up to $500,000, so they could rely on it for a period of time. But it was very targeted. And so for everybody else in our universe, all the other healthcare institutions that were accustomed to getting large capital grants from players like us, it was mystifying. Suddenly the welcome mat felt rolled up compared to what they had experienced. And I think sometimes where this work will and should lead us is to be more responsive to the need in the community, to target the work where it's most needed, to solve universal social problems by figuring out where the communities are that are in greatest need and addressing those needs first. And for that set of groups, it should feel easy, but for the rest of the community around that, it can feel like you're suddenly leaving them out of the equation. And we're in the middle of that. It's part of the challenge that we're trying to feed back to the community now is to say, we listened to you. You told us this was what was important. The research tells us this was what was important. And we're holding ourselves accountable to what you said you wanted in a foundation, which was one that cares more about impact and outcomes than about just scattering the money around. But superficially, you can see the analogy and the challenges from the community perspective.
There's been a word that has reappeared or appeared in our sector and been the cause of some controversy for some of our colleagues. The head of the Ford Foundation, our friend at Doris Duke, and that's the word pluralism. So the journalist in me has observed the state of our world with growing alarm, frankly. It's difficult to know what information to trust, civil discourse becoming the exception, not the rule, growing exchange about pluralism, one in which philanthropy is becoming vocal. Do you want to just weigh in on that? Everybody knows, I think, that this was a topic of an article that was signed by some of our colleagues, including Darren Walker at the Ford Foundation, Sam Gill at the Doris Duke Foundation, and then there was a lot of really rapid response to that around this whole idea of pluralism in our sector.
Yeah. Well, I love this topic. So, and yeah, it brings up hot button issues in our culture at the moment. And I think we need to have this conversation. There is a tension in the world, and in our world, that is between acknowledging that to fix the problems of our society, you absolutely have to look at the wrongs of the past and figure out how to undo them. And to address systemic inequities, this is the work of philanthropy. If we're going to look to root causes, we cannot not look at this. At the same time, we have to acknowledge that in our society, there is a break around how people perceive who that means and the extent to which they're at the table. And sometimes we fall into that trap by appearing to make the discussion exclusive. And I think what Darren in that article and others were driving at was, whatever our differences may be, we have to have the capacity to have a civil conversation. There were things said in that article that I would not have said. And I think like any article written by committee, I know for a fact it isn't what everybody in that who signed it would have said. But this is also what happens when people come together to try and reach common ground around a set of issues. I believe that our sector can display strong moral leadership about racial equity, about systemic inequities in our society, can display courage, can be honest about the problems that afflict our society, and at the same time welcome dialogue within the community about different ways of fixing those problems. And I think that's the distinction that sometimes we have failed to make as a sector, is that we believe that there is a litmus test, or we buy the idea that there is one true way of talking about these issues. And we know that there isn't. I've talked a lot about this with John Powell at the Othering and Belonging Institute here. I've had my own experience of talking about belonging as the central motif of the Conrad Prebys Foundation's work, and out of the blue getting pushback from people because it's quote unquote too woke. And I have no patience. But I do have patience for acknowledging that people are in different starting places in these conversations. And part of the role of philanthropy is helping our society figure out productive ways forward in addressing these issues. And sometimes that manifests I just yesterday had a conversation at my board meeting with the guy, Dr. Ben Maxwell, who is a pediatric psychologist at the Rady Children's Hospital in San Diego. And he was talking with our board about the crisis in youth mental and behavioral health in our community. And the 28-fold increase in emergency room visits around suicide and other behavioral and mental health crises over the past 10 years. So 28 goes from about 150 to 4,700, just to make those real numbers. And if you think about that being kids, what he very meticulously pointed out was, these numbers affect everybody. Here's how they tear down everybody's life. They particularly affect kids who are disadvantaged. Here's what that looks like. Here's how that plays out for healthcare systems, and here's how that plays out for society as a whole. And then he said, if I can paraphrase him correctly, and it will take every one of us to fix this problem. And too often we're caught up in the conversation about who we are trying to label as the target, as opposed to acknowledging that entire equation and how we are all genuinely in this together. And I do fear for our country in the context of the emerging dialogue around the presidential campaign, because we all saw what happened the last time we went down this path. And I do think it is a responsibility of philanthropy to do two things simultaneously, and it's hard. Display moral courage by talking about what's right and what we believe in, and helping our grantee organizations and communities do that as well, recognizing that every one of our institutions has a different mandate and a different board and operates in a different community. That looks different in different parts of the world. But do that, and do that with some degree of leadership, and at the same time, figure out how we maintain civil society in our communities, because our communities are the only level, for me, at which this country can still display its capacity to work and fix problems. And that's a little bit of an exaggeration. The federal government's still functioning, but it does feel so broken at the moment in terms of our capacity to have these discussions, and people are spending way too much time reading social media and watching cable TV. I just wish they'd hang out in rooms like this a little more and talk to each other.
Interesting conversations, right? Any questions? Jeff Baum.
I just want to pick up on something you said about displaying moral courage. My name is Jeff Baum, I'm Executive Director of Michelson Philanthropy. We also have a Medical Research Foundation. We do the grant giving, but also to display moral courage. We try to do that in a more tangible way by actually investing in policy advocacy. And so we set up a separate 501c4, hired lobbyists to get legislation passed that do that. How do you feel about foundations doing work? Because we find that we're often the only foundation on a list of sponsors of legislation that will change the systems that will benefit these populations.
Yeah, so I have two answers to that. One is about the C4 particularly, which is if you can do that, that's great. Wonderful. And most of the institutions that I know and talk to don't have that latitude either by charter or with their boards. But I think to have the courage to do that if you do is significant.
We'd like to have more foundations adapt their strategies to also improve that.
Well, and this is the second piece that I wanted to say, which is foundations as a whole have not been courageous in terms of thinking about advocacy as a component of our work. I think this is one of the trend lines that has gotten better over time.
Oh, it's certainly.
It has gotten a lot better over time, but it is not uncommon to hear in talking with colleagues that, I can't do advocacy because it's lobbying. Well, it's not lobbying. It's only lobbying if you cross certain lines, and if you can take the time to learn what the parameters are, you can actually be effective in a very here's what I know about our work, which I think most of the leaders that I respect recognize. We're going to do a lot of support in our early years of direct service organizations, because we need to establish those connections in the community and understand more intimately. Part of getting proximate with the community is understanding more intimately what they are up against and what they have to deal with. But following the trajectory outlined by my friend and inspiration at the Cal Endowment, we are on a trajectory to switch more and more of that over to advocacy over time, because we will never change the reality on the ground if we're not seeking to influence the larger systems of which those are a part. And so, I can only applaud you, but I think the important distinction is not to get caught up. Maybe not to get caught up in the form, whether it's a C3 or a C4, but to get to get inspired about the fact that we can all do more to influence larger systems, even within the parameters of traditional foundations.
I'm not sure, Richard, whether we've had you in public in a philanthropy, but a round of welcome appreciation for Richard Tate, new CEO and president of Wellness Foundation.
And just think he hasn't run out of the room yet.
I know. Give him a
with
minute. I have 8 questions to ask you, Grant, but I'm going to try and boil it down to one. So I'm channeling my experience leaving the city of Philadelphia and moving to San Diego some 20 odd years ago, and I spent 10 years there. And when I got one day over a glass of wine or a martini, we could talk about both pleasant surprises and unpleasant surprises in going to San Diego from the East Coast. But I'm struck by, and I told you this when I congratulated you, why did this foundation hire Grant Oliphant? And the reason I say that is because, and I'm sure San Diego has changed quite a bit. I think it has in the 20 years since I've been there. But while I was there, I worked for 5 white Republicans. There were about 8 generally white men, entitled white men, who were in charge in San Diego. That's how the place ran. It was the president of the chamber, a couple of bank presidents, a big, right? And then you would have the cranky quasi-progressive was our friend in City Heights, right? So it was a place where mostly entitled white guys were in charge. And that it was a place where people in charge of institutions were typically white, male, entitled, smart. I'm the smartest person in the room, kind of. Now I'm generalizing to make this point. And so of 100 people on a list, I would have put you at 99 for the Prebys Foundation to hire a thoughtful, reflective, someone who pauses and thinks and analyzes and listens. You did not come out of central casting for the leading foundation position in San Diego, from my perspective and my experience. And I was both thrilled, but shocked that they brought you in. And I'm wondering if you could say something about what happened in the conversation between you and the board or the search committee in that final interview where they said, "This is our guy." I mean, what did you say to them?
Thank you for that. I thank you.
I had no idea where he was going with that.
The whole thing shocked me too. I didn't have this on my radar. It wasn't something I was thinking a lot about. But let me speak. I'll try to answer your question and then also add my own reflections about why it attracted me, because they're connected. So the answer to your question about what I said to them in the interview was, if you're going to hire me, this is what's going to happen. And they said, okay. And I think now that interview was, the board at that stage was 4 guys. And it was kind of an accident of timing in terms of the evolution of the foundation that the board ended up at that moment being 4 guys. But part of what we talked about was how the board would look different, how the grant making would look different, and how differently we would approach the community. And that turned out to be what they wanted. And maybe it surprised them too, but this was a group very focused on one thing. They wanted to have an impact. They felt a personal degree of responsibility for having the largest foundation in San Diego history. under their stewardship, and they wanted it to have an impact. And that changed their calculation of what it looked like. So sitting here today, I can tell you that my board has gone from those 4 guys to 10 people. They had the questionable judgment to put me on the board. But that also meant that to reach gender parity, we had to have 5 women on the board, and today we have 5 women on the board. And we're a 10-person board that has expressed a commitment to increasingly mirroring the community that we're part of. So far, they've completely stood behind the commitment they made to me, and the sentiment that they expressed, which was, we care about commitment, so if this is what we have to do to get there, that's great. But I agree with you, given what I now know about San Diego's history. I wish you'd talked to me before. But what attracted me.
Did you mention and bring up the matter of belonging, which was so?
No, I did that afterwards.
Held that.
So very early on, we ended up at the border together for a protest around Friendship Park, and Bob asked me this question about, well, how does your board feel about you being here? And I said, well, we're about to find out. So part of what I believe is, I am very upfront about my core beliefs. And if I'm upfront with people about my core beliefs, I don't feel like I have to run for permission on everything I do, because they know what I'm about. And this is what they've said back to me is, we know what you're about, we know what we signed up for, and so far they've completely had my back, which I really appreciate. I was deeply attracted to this possibility because partly, as you know, I've wanted to live in California for a long, long time. It's a weird family history. We don't have to go into it here, but I saw in San Diego something similar and very different, but similar in what I saw in Pittsburgh, which was a storyline at a local level that could mirror a national narrative that mattered. And, in San Diego, I found a community that is not majority white, that is, has the largest presence of Indian reservations per capita in the country, that is a border city, that is...
what are the demographics of San Diego
it's
at this point in the
45%
21st century?
white, 38% Latino, 12% Asian Pacific Islander, and 6 or 7% African American.
And is that radically different than 10 years ago, for example? Because we've seen
Well, I think the Caucasian piece is certainly different.
Absolutely.
But this was a majority white community 10 years ago, but it is not, and it won't be again.
No.
The entire narrative around that county, which was once upon a time veterans and beaches and beer, still beaches and beer and a lot of veterans, but the narrative around that county is life sciences. It's about the border. If you look at the economy of the region, 25% of the economy is border-based. If you get in almost any Uber and take a ride in the city, just for kicks, you'll end up talking to somebody who spends the night in Tijuana because they're living across the border, and I cannot tell you how many people in my experience, even on my own staff, have that experience. So
Can you tell us what is going on in the border?
That I can above my pay grade. No, but we are.
I only say that
Yeah.
because it's been so illuminated. It's such a part of our dialogue in this country right now, and it.
I think the sad. Well, I have two answers to that. One is that our dialogue around the border is so broken, and it is broken because of absolute refusal at the national policy level to make obvious fixes that Washington knew how to make 10 years ago and will not make, because they would rather engage in political opportunism than do the right thing. And that's, I think that's, so, you know, somehow we have to get back to rational, sane national policy that acknowledges the right of some people to enter and the need of some people to enter and the rational need for borders and what the function that they play in international society. But the other thing that leaps out at me is you cannot walk around San Diego and not get a sense for how glorious we actually refer to it in San Diego as a tri-national region, how glorious a tri-national culture can be. And you have it here, so I'm not telling LA anything that it is news to you, but the rest of the country needs more of this. So that for me is an example of where philanthropy could do a lot better job of talking about the opportunity and the vision. I think we rightly spend a lot of time diagnosing the problem around othering and around the ways in which the society is driving people apart, and the crisis at the border and all of that. But we also should be celebrating what it looks like when cultures come together and the distinct cultures that emerge and that are part of America.
Which is uniquely American. American.
You spoke early on about the center of gravity being one of the major differences between a private foundation and a community foundation. Can you talk about some of the other ones and what some of the lessons learned from private that you're applying to your new position and community?
Well, so just to be clear, this is not a quote-unquote community foundation. This is a private foundation, but it doesn't have a family involved in it. So the donor didn't leave any of his family members engaged on the board. And therefore the community, the board is meant to represent the community and self-perpetuates. I think that for a leader of the foundation, the biggest difference is when I was at the Heinz Endowments, I had, I've had a very privileged life in this work. I never intended to come into philanthropy. I came into this work because I was working for U.S. Senator John Heinz in the U.S. Senate in 1991 when he was killed in a plane crash. And that essentially changed my life. I got to know his widow, Teresa. She asked me to eventually to come and work for her. I said no, because I didn't know what philanthropy was. And then 2 years later, she asked me again, and I leapt at it. And I, what I learned in working for the Heinz family was, which had a unique gift for transferring values down through the generations, was what a precious gift it is when you're working in a family context to have a family whose values you share. I think that job would be impossible if you were constantly having to compromise what you cared about. And what I had to always understand was where my values were in alignment, and if they weren't, then I had to be very clear on whose hat I was wearing when I did certain things. So when I talk about center of gravity, that was the weight that it carried in a family foundation. In this context, in some ways similar to leading a community foundation, if you're going to lead a community foundation like Antonia did here, with a focus on community leadership, that center of gravity has to come from within. Because if it's coming from your board, then it's not strong enough for it to sustain you through the days. And I've really had to work on that, actually. That is for me one of the biggest differences. I think the other difference that I'd say is it has made me much more sensitive to the ways in which the community needs us to behave. I could accept certain ways of operating because they were the way we'd always done things, because they were handed down through a family legacy, that now that I'm in the mode of inventing an organization from scratch, it's much harder for me to do because I don't have that the way we always did things. Actually, one of the funniest, I have to share this, one of the funniest conversations I had, like, you know, after, I mean, this foundation had existed for a year, and I actually had conversations when I first arrived there with people about the way we'd always done things. No! So, but you know, that impulse runs deep, and so one of the biggest changes is that I've just had to really check myself on that.
I'm going to wrap up on that wonderful note and that wonderful story of just being humble like you are. We thank you so much, you know, for your frankness and just sharing with us really your refreshing comments. We thank you so much. And we can continue our dialogue in an informal way at the reception on the patio. For those of you in the audience, thank you for your time and hope. It's so nice for me. Oh, it's so nice for me. And lastly, I want to make sure I thank the center's team. Greg, I think you're out there somewhere. Where are you? Greg, Antoinette, and Jeff for making these convenings possible. And we hope to see everybody at upcoming events. This was great. Thank you very, very, very much.